Okay. Hi, welcome, welcome, welcome. Well, I want you to introduce yourself. And after you've introduced yourself, your name, where you're at today, what you're doing, um, I'd love for you to go back in time to what got you rolling on this kind of work and your care for the environment, for water, and what you do.
I'm Nigel D'Souza. I am an assistant professor at Gonzaga University. I have a joint appointment in the biology department and the environmental studies and science department. Uh, let's see, I'm an environmental microbiologist by training. A lot of my work tends to focus on photosynthetic microbes and the movement of carbon and elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., through microbial food webs. And I kind of try to connect that with effects that this has on kind of larger organisms through the food web. My work kind of focuses also on how these microbes respond to changes in the environment. Some of the big ones are changes like climate change, changes associated with climate change, and changes associated with the input of pollutants, for example, or things like eutrophication. Um, I had some time working on the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, so I've looked at how things like that, like accidents that we have result in changes in these microbial ecosystems. In terms of what got me into this,
Yeah,
let's
take your
see.
time.
I uh, I don't think I planned it. I can say that I don't think I ever planned to be a specialist in this particular field. I think ever since I was a child, I liked being outside. I just had a natural affinity for ecosystems, ecology, just kind of working with animals, working with plants, trying to understand how they work, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of no matter how much I tried to get into, let's say, physics or math or something, it was always biology that I tended to do well in. And so I just kind of like focused on my strengths and tried to kind of move in that direction. And one thing led to another. And eventually I was a microbiologist. And that basically gave me the option of working either in the medical industry or in the environmental industry. I kind of went in the environmental direction. And then that basically kind of took me to Ohio, where I was studying microbes and ice, and then one thing led to another, and then I was studying microbes and how they respond to oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. I did a couple of stints in Antarctica where I was looking at microbes under the ice and how they respond to changing conditions there. And then, just those were the projects that I've always been affected with, and I've always been involved with. And all of these projects had a common theme is that we have these microbes. They exist in these systems. They carry out essential functions. Everything kind of is propped up by these communities. And these communities are experiencing change. And we don't have a good idea of how they are going to respond to that change. And so a lot of my work is trying to kind of figure that out, is I kind of create these changes in a lab space and then look at responses and then try to put two and two together to figure out where that's going.
Mm. I'm just curious. I'm going to take you there again, just because it's popping into my heart. Like when you were a child, do you remember your relationship, a story, relationship to the environment that is particularly meaningful for you where you grew up?
Um, let's see. I, I I I don't think I can come up with just one instance. I remember as a kid, like every small thing from like I remember well, this isn't formative in any like huge way, but I remember this thing of like watching moss grow on bricks. And then I wanted to know what that was and why it grows on what looked to me as a kid as stone, essentially. And then I tried to grow different kinds of moss on bricks at home just to see if I could do it, and how they like if I could figure out what was happening, and then realizing that they grow on certain stones but not on other stones, and then trying to figure out what that was, and then some of them had like what looked like flowering parts and others did not, and then I was trying to figure out if animals eat that or if they don't eat it and what like, and so it was just this kind of like weird curiosity of like what is this and why is it there. And I think that played out in different ways. I remember we had these like seasonal these toads that were in the region that I grew up in, and they would have these seasonal flourishes where they would have their mating season, and then you'd have like all the kind of ponds and water systems in the area would just be filled with tadpoles, and then they would disappear, and then you wouldn't see them for the rest of the year, and you know just trying to figure out like, okay, why does this exist? Where is it going? What's happening? It was things like that that just kind of, it was just a natural curiosity of all of these things. Uh, and I think, oh, the one thing that was definitely formative was I grew up not in a city. I grew up kind of at the edge of a city, and so right
And where
behind
was
my house.
that,
This
Nigel?
was back in India. Yeah, thank you. This was back in India, and I lived in. I used to always define it as a small city when I moved here, and then I realized I should stop saying that because my definition of a small city was about like 5 million people. Uh, so, by Indian standards, that's a small city. And so I lived at the outside, kind of the outskirts of the city, and towards the back of my house was these mountains, these kind of like grasslands, and there were lots of like shrublands in the area, and so it was very wild, and it wasn't unusual for me to like wake up in the morning and basically notice that there's mongoose in the garden, or there's like a cobra moving through it, or there's peacocks or monkeys on the trees outside the house, and like, so it was this kind of wilderness area, and I'd see this like crazy diversity of birds and songbirds and everything in the areas, and then as I grew up, I realized that I was seeing them go. Like they were peacocks no longer showed up. Monkeys were extremely rare. And then there was this one bird called a hoopoe, Hoopoe, that, as a kid, I remember like being fascinated by it. It looked kind of like a woodpecker, but it was kind of one of those things that were big insects from crevices and everything. And then I realized one day that I hadn't seen one in forever. And these things were everywhere. And then all of a sudden, I haven't seen one. And then I kind of started paying attention, and it never showed up. It Year after year, I would kind of keep an eye out and like just realize that this thing was gone. And then like, watching the trees disappear, watching kind of like erosion happen in that area, just everything was kind of starting to fall apart. And it had something to do with the way that space was being managed by people. And I think if I were to
Say that
like
again. It had to do with what, Nigel?
the way people were managing that space.
People, humans.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah,
What
yeah.
age range were you in that? This magic of the wonderful world and all these creatures and the ecosystem, and then seeing this change. Can you kind of remember that
I
age range?
I think it was somewhere around middle and high school. Middle school is probably where I started, like late middle school is where I started noticing that this was a thing. But the
The change
the
was happening.
context, exactly, yes, yes, exactly. The change was noticed around that time, but the context came in from like my childhood days, from like as far back as I could remember, from like as a child being fascinated by the fact that there was a cobra 10 feet away from me moving through the garden that we had outside our house, and like realizing that that was just a thing, and then suddenly realizing I haven't seen one in years, from something that was like present all the time to something that is just gone. And then the same thing with that bird, and same thing realizing like monkeys no longer show up, and but this was as a child, it wasn't weird for me to see it. But when I was in middle school, if I saw one of these things, it was kind of a big deal. And that realization that something that was completely normal is either not happening or it happens so rarely now was, I think, something that really kind of like, I don't want to use the word traumatic, but it was a bit of a jarring realization that like something's gone. We just lost something and nobody's paying attention. And I think that yeah, so now that I'm thinking about it, I think that may have been kind of a very formative, like that is what really pushed it took that natural curiosity that I had, and then you have this jarring experience, and then realizing that that is what I want to look into, that is what I want to figure out, that is what I want to fix, and I want to be part of a solution to this whole thing, not part of what contributes to the problem. And I
Yeah.
think it was that basically kind of put me on this trajectory.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. I want to share with you two things that humans aren't managing it right, right? I grew up on this hillside in Seattle, and as a kid, uh, frequently there would be mudslides because the hillside is naturally unstable. The Indigenous had a word for it that I discovered later, something about springs coming through hillside, and so there were constantly mudslides. We lost our entire road. In the 1980s, my mom had to drag the groceries a certain couple hundred feet, a couple hundred yards actually, um, to get to our house. There were houses that were lost. So there was this kind of terrifying feeling as a child, and this instability. And then eventually in the 1990s, mid 1990s, there was so much rain and snowfall and melt that we lost our house and a few others. Um, and it wasn't until much later in my adult years that I was able to figure out, oh, houses never should have been built there. That like this was a human managed area that was unsustainable. But I could feel that lack of stability, all through my childhood. But the other piece that I think fits really well that I hadn't thought of until this moment, listening to you and to your work, we could get down to the beach of the Puget Sound from our house. And one of my father's favorite things to do was clam dig. And we'd have these big clam digs. And we moved in there when I was about 3, the late 70s. And for years, we had these clam dig parties. And then all of a sudden, they stopped. Sometime in my childhood, young, maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. And I never knew why, other than the red tide algae
Yes. Mhm.
became so frequent and so frequent that it wasn't safe to anymore. Too much work to figure out and test the clams. And when I started working on this project that you're involved with now, the sea change within us, one of our interviewees is a marine biologist, and he was able to confirm for me that there was this more explosive outbreaks of algae, of this red tide algae, um, because of climate change. And I need to do more research on understanding that. But yeah, so I just wanted to share that with you, that maybe not so much cognitively, mentally, more just in an embodied sense, in a heart sense, there was something that was really off that I knew, as you knew,
Absolutely.
until we began to actually really know. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, yeah,
I
thank you.
wanted to
Yeah.
give you the floor to come back to your work in microbes. Yeah, and why they matter. Why should humans care about microbes?
Ah, so I'll use an example of something I use in one of my classrooms that usually gets a lot of students just very wide-eyed, which is going through middle and high school. Everyone here learns about the food web and the whole pyramid structure of this large amount of plants that is then consumed by a smaller number of like herbivores, and those then get consumed by a smaller number of carnivores and so on, and kind of it forms this pyramid structure. And I say, okay, let's look at a marine ecosystem. Let's go if you are interested in working with polar bears, if you're interested in working with orcas. These are things that are like all the way at the top of that pyramid, right?
Yeah.
And so let's look at that marine food web and how it kind of branches out. And you kind of come down, down, down to the herbivores, and then you kind of get to a point where you realize the ocean doesn't have plants. That bottom rung that is in terrestrial systems doesn't exist in the ocean. The only plants you see are in really shallow areas where light can go all the way down to the bottom. And that's what harbors certain things like seagrasses or something. But that's not basically what's sustaining an entire ocean. 70% of the planet's surface is ocean. and there are no plants in there. And yet you have all of this massive amount of fish that's somehow being sustained in that system, right? So all of these guys are basically feeding off of photosynthetic microbes that are growing in the ocean. And so microbes sustain that entire kind of food pyramid. So that's number one. The other thing that is really fascinating is unlike terrestrial systems where the plants have this massive amount that sustain a smaller amount of herbivores, in marine ecosystems, you have a very small amount of microbes that sustain a much larger quantity of fish. And so people are often confused by that in the sense of, okay, wait, that doesn't make any sense. How do you have a small amount of stuff sustaining a much larger amount? And the kind of analogy that I would give is imagine if you were eating a meal and your meal was basically just two Brussels sprouts and that's it. But imagine in the time that it took you to pick up one of them and chew it and swallow it, the one that's on the plate has now divided into two. And then you eat one of those, and in the time that it takes, the one has divided into two. So, in other words, you start with just two really small Brussels sprouts, but you can basically have multiple meals because they divide so quickly. And that's the key is the speed at which these microbes divide is basically what is sustaining that entire ecosystem.
Mm.
And the reason why that detail is super, super, super critical is when we have things like climate change, one of the things that these like higher temperatures or the more acidic conditions of the ocean, one of the things that it does is it impairs the ability of the microbes to reproduce quickly. So it may not kill them, but they can't reproduce as fast as they are used to. And if that happens, and we're just starting to get a sense of what that looks like, and if that happens, one of the consequences is that what was once an abundant food source for the entire ocean still exists, but it can no longer sustain the ocean the way it's supposed to. And we don't really have a good grasp on how that's playing out. We are still trying to figure out. I'm still in the process of doing experiments that nobody's ever done before to kind of try to figure that out. And it's starting to look like there are certain microbes that are impaired in the process. And so we're looking at entire food web cascades that are currently propped up on this platform, and that platform's no longer going to be there. And that is terrifying. And so when we think of, we're talking about 70% of the Earth's surface is basically kind of propped up by this system. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so
Go
in terms
go
of
further with that. Yeah,
yeah,
because why? Because people got fatigue with hearing about the polar bears, and I think as you know, my effort is to bring hearts, minds, and bodies back into ourselves and into this interconnected world to really understand why all of this matters and why we need to change our human behaviors that have managed, controlled, dominated our ecosystems, and now created so much havoc. And now we need to change that. So why does this matter to humans?
yeah, and so like let's see, let's take the most recent traumatic experience that humans have had as a population, which is COVID, right? And you basically are looking at a viral infection that started somewhere and basically spread through the entire human population. Now, irrespective of what one's set feelings are about ecology and environmental research, everybody cares about human health. So I'll basically just stay on that point. If that is what we care about, if that is something that we can all, irrespective of our ideology, agree that that matters, then climate change is going to hit that, and it's going to hit that hard. And it's going to do one way it's going to do that. So like one of the things that we study in one of my classes is this idea of we have glaciers around the world that are melting. Um, there are many effects of that, but one of the issues associated with that is some of these glaciers and some of the places that have permafrost, for example, are basically uh, essentially freezers that were turned on millions of years before humans existed. When those freezers were turned on, there were microbes in there that got frozen solid. Those microbes can be revived. Not all of them, but many of them can be revived. Some of them could be pathogens, and we've not had any exposure that gives us an immune system that basically can handle this. There may be microbes in there that could basically wipe out the entire human population. And yes, I'm being a little over dramatic with this. So it's not like it is going to happen, but it can. There could be microbes in there that are um, tolerant of a lot of our defenses right now and could basically break through them. Um, there are things like with more human animal interactions, the more we kind of cut down forests, the more we build structures inside forests, the more we kind of go in there, the the more we have, the probability of encounters between animals and humans goes up. And the chance that a pathogen that is currently in an animal species would basically mutate and jump over to a human, which is basically what happened with COVID, the chances of that go up. So our tendency to cause habitat destruction it's not just about habitat destruction, it has a human health impact as well. And this is all coming through the microbial kind of the pathogen kind of perspective. Then we have the entire food web, which is if anyone eats fish, A, that's going to be affected. But let's say, you have a bunch of people who say, okay, we don't eat fish, we don't eat meat, marine fisheries are not in it. Well, if you look at the 9 billion and counting population that we have on the planet, a giant swath of that population gets its protein from seafood. And when you basically have an ocean that can no longer sustain fisheries globally the way it's doing right now, you basically have billions of people who are going to now not, who are basically going to experience nutritional stress. Those people are going to seek food or nutritional kind of sources. They're going to seek nutrition from other sources. What does that even look like? And what are the consequences? Like, what happens when an entire coastal population comes inwards, trying to basically just survive, right? These things are going to affect people. And so, like, these are things that, like, at that point, one's ideology is going to be irrelevant. It doesn't matter at that point. What they think about politics, what they think about left versus right, conservative versus liberal, none of that is going to matter at that point. It's going to come down to survival. And so, like, what we're doing is basically we're hurting ourselves by not paying attention to these details. And depending on your area of expertise, you're going to see different things. Like I'm a microbiologist, the saying of when you hold a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of a thing. Uh, Kind of one way of looking at that is I'm a microbiologist. And so when I look at the world, I kind of gravitate towards microbial components in there in many different ways. And so that's how I see it. And if people want to kind of just realize like how significant these things could be, the other thing that my students just can't seem to like process easily is this idea that if you think about it, sharks were swimming on this planet before plants existed. Those animals were sustained by microbes at the bottom of the food web. There were no plants at some point in Earth's history, but there were animals. And those animals, there was an entire food web and everything in existence, and it existed without a single plant. Plants came after animals, which is not how people tend to think about it because everybody thinks of plants as the bottom of the food web and everything is propped up on that. Whereas, but no, there was a food web where there were no plants at all. And so, again, I'm speaking as a microbiologist. I tend to kind of, I'm definitely biased towards that kind of idea of looking at microbes, but they play a huge role in the functioning of everything that we know.
Yeah.
Um, and this is a little outside my area of expertise, but another really fascinating thing about microbes, for example, is let's say just if we take a moment and just think about something that makes us happy. just even for a brief moment. What's really interesting about that process is that whatever that thought was that got into our head at that point, we as a human were not in full control of that thought. We have an entire biome on us that is generating chemicals. Those chemicals are influencing our nervous system, and that nervous system is being hardwired and programmed with input from that system. And if that system changed, our thought might have been slightly different.
I have to ask you, are you familiar with Dr. Bayo Akamalafe?
No, that no,
Oh,
no,
you
no,
have
no,
to
no.
read that's exactly, I mean, he's a Nigerian philosopher, thinker. He calls himself a recovering psychologist. Um, he writes about, um, I mean, he's talked about how the slave trade was just as much to do with the microbiome desire for sugar as it was,
Oh,
for the larger aspects um, of human dominance. And he has a wonderful essay on COVID, Mother Monster something. He talks about things like our grief is not just our own, but it's the grief of Orca. It's the grief
oh,
of,
wow.
but he exactly, how do you say, we're biomes, that we are these systems that are there. I talk about from a perspective of movement, that there are streams of movement moving through us and impacting our thinking, our feeling, our knowing, we can tap into more of that as well. So you need to check out Dr. Bayo Akamalafe. You two would be right up the same um,
Yeah.
river of thinking about the world in a better way. Um, Nigel, I have a couple curiosities before we finish today. I'm not sure which one to put toward you. I'm curious because there is a whole section on ice that I have. And you mentioned a little bit about the glacier melt, but I'm curious if you, from your own research, if you want to share anything about microbiomes. And I think you said you did research on sea ice. Is there
Yeah,
anything you'd like to
yeah.
share that, not just the science around it, but why it matters as it relates to the melting of sea ice and climate change, if there's anything important for us to know?
Okay. I'll try to do this as a story. So,
Nice.
2007, I moved here from India. I moved to Ohio, and I get on a project that involves looking at microbes in ice, or rather under ice. And so this is the Great Lakes. They freeze solid over winter. And what a couple of people found out was that below the ice, there are essentially these large clouds of algae that are just blooming through winter. And when I say large, I mean when we were going with a Coast Guard icebreaker through one of these, the largest one that we went through was about something like 5 miles long. It's that big and it's completely under the ice. And so my job was to basically figure out what that is, what it's doing there, what its ecological significance is, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my task. And so I'm out on the boat and we're collecting these samples. And something I notice is one of the things we do is we look at like where they position themselves in the water. And so I take these things and I put them into a glass tube and I watch them. And within a couple of minutes, the entire thing just sinks down to the bottom. Okay, that's weird. I mean, I know that these things tend to be heavy because they have glass shells around them, and so they
The
tend to
algae
the
sinks to the
algae.
bottom. This
Yeah,
microbiome,
this exact
micro
yeah, this whole like assemblage that's there of microbes.
of
When I
microbes.
exactly, yeah. I mean, so I'm classifying these algae as the microbes that I'm looking at, and obviously they are connected with like bacteria that grow on them and everything. But when I'm looking at this, just this glop of brown stuff that I pull out from the water and I put it into a chamber and I watch it how it settles. I'm expecting it to float because in the lake they are right under the ice. But the moment I put them in this thing, they just kind of sink to the bottom. So none of the scientists on the ship now have an explanation for how to reconcile these observations. In the lab, they sink. In the field, they're floating. So what is it? Exactly. But how? How does that happen? Because what these things are basically in sediments all the way at the bottom of the lake, and something causes them to grow. And the idea is when they grow, they should basically come up to the surface, meaning they're buoyant. But our lab observations say that they're not buoyant. So we're missing something, right? So that's one observation. Now I'm collecting material and bringing it back to my lab for analysis. And I ship them in these coolers with ice all around it. And I bring them to the lab. I pull out these containers, and I have like a whole lines of these tubes, some of which contain the algae and some of which just have water in them. And every single tube that has algae has frozen solid. And the ones with the water that are in the same cooler, in the same rack, quite literally, are still liquid. They're not supposed to freeze because the ice was just supposed to keep them cold so that I could bring them back and test them in the lab. And so I come up with this and I go up to my advisor and I go, these things are forming ice. And literally the professors there go, that's not a thing. And I was like, that can't be, like, it's way too much of a coincidence. And so this happens about 4 times in a row. And I'm like constantly going up and saying, I'm pretty sure these things are forming ice because nothing else is freezing except these guys.
Wow.
They tell me there's no precedence for this. This is not a thing, but they are uh, kind of the advices that I wish everybody had, which is basically they said, if you have an idea, if you see something and you think this is weird, however weird it is, if you have a way to explore it, go for it. We're not going to stop you. And I am at a research conference now, and my roommate happens to be a professor who studies wood frogs. So nothing, no overlap. He studies how wood frogs freeze solid in winter and then just thaw out when spring comes back in. And so it's this awkward conversation. He actually locked himself out of his room while he was taking a shower. And so it's me and him sitting. He's in basically a towel, and that's it. It's this very awkward conversation. He's a senior professor. It's like, well, I have to make conversation now. So I'm going to just, he mentioned wood frogs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ice and my thing. And I say, hey, I have this weird idea. If wood frogs can do this, I was wondering if you have any context of microbes or algae doing it. And he goes, never heard of that. But he says, I have equipment in my lab that we could do some tests with. So why don't you bring your stuff over? And so I drive 4 hours over to his lab with my stuff, and we do a couple of tests. And lo and behold, what we find is that the algae are able to form ice at temperatures before everything else freezes. And then we start doing these advanced tests, and basically what it is it's not the algae, it's the bacteria that are growing on the algae. They can produce ice before everything else around them starts freezing. So when the temperatures are cold, but not so cold enough to form ice, they start forming ice ahead of time. And the way they do it is, the way they do it is they have a cell wall that basically has on it proteins that resemble the physical structure of ice. And when water molecules line up on this protein, they think it's an ice crystal. And so they start crystallizing around it. So if the temperature is okay for the water molecules to stop moving, they will start crystallizing. But the nucleation point is not an ice crystal, it's a bacterial protein.
Oh my gosh.
And so, okay, so why is this a big deal? Because in fall, as the waters are cooling down, deep down, these guys start producing ice. And what that does is any cell that is connected to it now starts getting buoyant and floats up to the top. The rest of the lake is not frozen yet, but these ice crystals have brought these cells to the top. And now the lake surface, as it gets colder, starts freezing, and these things get stuck to that ice as it's freezing to the top. The reason this is important is algae are photosynthetic organisms. They need light to function. And when the lake is frozen, they now have basically embedded themselves at a point where they have the highest likelihood of getting light. And they basically grow out of the ice as these like hanging things. And that's what we were looking at as clouds. And so it was this whole process. It was like 2 years of me trying to convince people that this is a thing, nobody believing me. And then a year of research. And then we have this like high profile paper that came out that basically said, microbes actually geoengineer their own environment to create habitat that works for them.
Oh my
And so,
gosh. I mean, wow. At first, I want to say congratulations that you were given this direction in life somehow or another by the streams of movement, to be able to discover this research and published this great paper that I imagine where it might have been.
Huh?
Maybe we could have a link to that. Wow. And the other thing I want to say is that is one of the most beautiful things I've heard in terms of our life, of this life. And I wrote down a word when you were talking. You said weird, so weird. And again, back to Bioakamalafe, he talks about we need to be queering our understanding of the world and the beauty of that and the queerness of the world, and like really embracing that the world is more unusual and strange and bewildering and wonderful. And we've sort of, I think at one point maybe humans still live with that today, but there are many that don't. And coming back to this, I mean, your research is such a beautiful returning to that mystical, larger than life, interconnected place that we get to be a part of, and that we should stop screwing up. Wow, thank you for that. I thought you were going to go in the direction of ocean and sea ice, but thank you. I'm so happy to have something from a lake.
So this actually moves in that direction, which is
Okay.
we know that under sea ice, we are seeing these massive blooms, but nobody really has a good, like nobody studied them because it's really hard to go out onto the ice. It's really expensive. You have to have like specialized divers who can go below the ice, or you need to have like very, very expensive ROVs that can go below the ice and do this. And so we just know that it exists, but we don't know how it functions. And so the question is this happening over there? And the reason this is a big deal, because if this stuff is growing in winter through their ability to make ice, if we have global warming, they can no longer stay at the surface. Their ability to kind of embed themselves in ice is what's keeping that system going. If we lose the ice, we lose the microbes. If we lose the microbes, we lose the food for everything else. And so seals, polar bears, crabs, you go from microbes to small crustaceans to things like larger things like crab and fish. Those things feed the seals feed things like orcas, polar bears.
Yeah.
Everything collapses
Yeah.
because we lost the ice. And it's the microbes under the ice that were sustaining it. And they need the ice to stay in that kind of surface area. And so one of my goals, I don't have the funding to do it yet, but one of my goals is to take that work that I did in the Great Lakes and basically say, we see parallels in sea ice. We don't understand it. We have some context. Let me explore that in the regions that have sea ice, because people should know what we would lose when we lose the ice. It's not just ice disappearing and now we have a shipping channel through the North Sea. Like that's sure, we do, but what have we lost in the process? I think I think I think that's what I would like to explore. I would like to explore exactly what it is that's underneath there and what goes along with the ice, which because it's below the ice, it's out of sight, out of mind, and people don't make that connection. And that's my connection to ocean stuff is I want to take that concept, that phenomenon that we figured out in lakes and realize that something very similar is happening under sea ice. And can we do it? Can we kind of do it over there? Yeah.
Phenomenal. Well, I wish you all the possibilities of funding, and who knows what will happen in the next 4 years of this federal government, but I hope somehow or another the blessings come to be able to do that work. You know, we're almost out of time, but I do want to bring us back to Washington State. And I know you've been here for 3 years working in the eastern side at Gonzaga. Is there anything you would specifically like to share with us about your work, climate change, microbes, and what we should know about our state, anything in particular?
I'm still very fresh in terms of exploring these things, and a lot of my work right now, for better or worse, is lab experiments. And so I have things confined in a lab, and I haven't quite made it out into the field to explore. So the goal behind the lab experiments is to basically get myself set up so that I can go into the field and start making measurements out there. Things like the occurrence of harmful algal blooms in coastal areas or in freshwater lakes, especially if it's a water source, for example. That is something that I want to kind of go deeper into. And we haven't talked about this much yet, but another element of my work is environmental toxicology. And I teach a class in toxicology over here in ecotoxicology, and one of the things that one of my lectures is on the Hanford site, which I did not know about until I moved here and started like looking for local examples of what to talk about. And this idea that the Hanford site is the most polluted spot in the Western Hemisphere, which that was news to me. I did not know about that. Even as somebody who was teaching toxicology in Louisiana, I did not know about this until I actually moved here. And the impact that that's had on the Columbia River over time is just like the more I was reading, the more I just couldn't believe what I was seeing in terms of like this actually happened. It's documented and no one's talking about it, which is weird, right? And then like I've been doing a little bit of reading on the Puget Sound area and the issues associated with pollution in the area and how those pollutants are impacting salmon populations over there, and obviously that has consequences for the orcas up. And yeah, so some of my work is looking at what I want to do is look at the role of microbes in either facilitating these issues or in remedying it potentially. And so that's something that's going to happen down the road as well. Um,
Could you say a
yeah.
little bit more about the role of microbes facilitating versus remedying the toxic impact humans have on our waters?
So I haven't studied this in the Puget Sound area or in this area, but when I was in Louisiana, we were basically looking at these toxic cyanobacterial blooms that were starting to show up, especially in the warmer months. And one of the things that's really weird about these guys is they produce toxin at a specific time, but there's no clear understanding of what triggers that. And so we were trying to kind of pin that down is like, what exactly can we point at as environmental variables? Was it temperature? Was it light? Was it something that was causing that? And one of our one of the things we found there was it was heavy metal pollution. So the presence of zinc was associated with the production of the toxin. And turns out the mechanism is, and this is our hypothesis, this is not something that we've officially kind of like published yet, but we're working with this hypothesis that the cyanobacteria are not trying to kill anything. The toxin is actually their way of flushing out pollutants from their cells. And it happens to be something that is toxic to everything else. So when you have zinc coming in and it's getting into their cells, they need to get rid of it. And so they make a substance that binds to that zinc that they can then push out. And that substance happens to be toxic to everything around it. So so that's the hypothesis we're playing with. I can't say that that is certain for sure. We're still working on it, but
Yeah.
it's this idea of like that's how, you know, certain things that we do could basically trigger mechanisms or physiological responses in microbes that could actually make things worse. So these microbes are natural. They're not, the microbes weren't put in place by humans, but how they respond could make a situation just normal or it could make it super toxic. And that's one way in which the microbes could make things worse. Another way in which they could do it is some of these microbes could sequester and concentrate certain pollutants in them. And in doing so, they would basically move those through the food web and basically kill organisms up the food chain by simply by concentrating mechanisms. And so that's something that I want to kind of explore. And a way in which they could fix them is some of these microbes actually can produce enzymes that can break down some pollutants. And so if we have these microbes, we might be able to actually remediate certain environments or certain ecosystems by actually using them to break it down. And so they can have both a positive and a negative impact depending on how they're used. With oil spills, that's one of the mechanisms that people are looking into is we know that there are bacteria that break down oil. So if we have a spill, can we go to these beaches and can we spray these beaches down with this liquid that contains these bacteria? And the bacteria will essentially break down oil, that toxic, tarry kind of substance into something more kind of amenable or something that's less dangerous to the wildlife or something in the area.
The
Uh,
ecosystem.
exactly, exactly. And so that kind of remediation strategy is something that they can do as well.
Okay. Well, I mean, this just leads me to one last question. It's kind of a big one, probably multi-pronged for you. you teach young people, you're helping them understand the problems. You mentioned zinc as a toxin. I don't even know exactly where that's coming from in terms of our human impact. So maybe you could share that. How The other thing I want to say, actually make a comment about that question I'm getting to is, oh, I don't know, was it Einstein that said something about creating more problems with doing, humans doing it. I can't remember the quote. I should know it, but the concern, I mean, you hear people talking about cloud seeding to deal with carbon. And so the concern is, for many people, is humans have created so much destruction and problems because of our high and mightiness, thinking, we have it all figured out in the world, that we're just going to create more problems. Your microbiome remedy does not sound like a problem. So what are your students thinking about and learning in terms of how to reverse, mitigate, undo, adapt? What are you hoping for to see? If you could really be visionary right now, be visionary. How would you're taking all that you're providing for your students in terms of your research, and those that can step forward and do policy, do technology. What are you hoping for and envisioning in this future of recreating our relationship to the natural world?
Um, yeah, this is going to be tricky to articulate because it's complex. So, from an educational standpoint, one of the things, like especially working with undergraduate students here, one of the things that I think is absolutely critical in that process is basically telling them or kind of showing them that these kind of processes, these solutions, these problems are not black and white. There's no, like, it isn't just this or that.
They're
There are
weird.
exactly. I like that word a lot, actually. I tend to use it a lot. But it's this weirdness that comes in. It's this all these weird shades of gray that you're going to encounter. And there's no real right or wrong. Like it doesn't really quite play out the way they think they are. And a lot of their preconceived ideas of the world are not really based in evidence. And I think for them, once they realize that, they start thinking more on the lines of like, okay, what information are we getting? And is this information actually valid? And kind of an example that really strikes people is microplastics. Everybody says microplastics are bad, it's dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And I say, okay, can you show me one body of literature that says, here's how many microplastics we have in the environment, and that level is a problem because it does this. That doesn't exist. Every study that we have has like massive doses of plastics that are either injected into animals or they're exposed to it in very unnatural ways. And we have studies where large chunks of plastic, like turtles eating plastic bags and birds eating bottle caps and stuff like that is killing them. So we have all of these like evidence, but this idea of being nuanced and saying like, okay, just because you feel that microplastics right now in the environment are killing everything doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually like that. We don't have any evidence. You made that up. You've gone with microplastics are bad, which we know, and you know that plastics are killing things, and you've put two and two together to make up something that we don't have any evidence for. And the reason I think that detail is important is because sometimes that it comes with a feeling of hopelessness in the sense of like, well, microplastics are all around us, it's killing everything, we're doomed anyway.
I'm
And
just
I
going to go on
just
TikTok and avoid it all.
exactly, and I'm pointing out we don't have evidence that we're doomed. We don't have evidence that this is a done deal yet. Like it is very fixable. And if you understand that, you basically could be motivated to actually step up and make that change. Because if you feel like completely disillusioned, like if you feel completely unmotivated to work on anything, you're not going to. I don't know. This is how I view them. If they see this as like, well, microplastics are already there, we can't really do anything about it. Why bother? I want to change that perspective. I want to basically try to show them that things can be fixed. And I also want to make it clear that we don't have all the time in the world. This is a pressing problem and it needs to happen now. And I want them to start understanding the like how our actions translate into these things. So like the idea of populations and how human populations drive consumption and how like a combination of population and consumption basically is altering the world. The idea of a carrying capacity, the idea that ecosystems can function just fine with us in it as long as we don't take out as much as what it can replenish. But how do you calculate that? How do you figure out what the stopping point is? I don't have an answer, but I want them to start thinking about it. I want them to consciously think about this. And it's just like I want them to have a better connection with the world around them. Like I want them to understand things. And so I kind of use my teaching approaches to kind of gather around that. Like, I teach a class in Earth systems, for example, and I open with the origin of the universe. And people will often wonder, like, why? And it comes down to this idea of like, if you think about yourself as a person, and you think about the blood that's flowing through you, and at the center of each molecule of hemoglobin in that blood is a atom of iron. That iron, that atom, there's only one place it could have come from, which is the heart of a dying star. It was formed in the few microseconds before a star exploded. And that's the only place it can come from that we know of. Every single atom of iron was formed in the final moments of a star exploding. And all of that somehow coalesced into what is flowing through us right now. And this idea of like that connection with everything around is not something that people think of consciously. And I kind of want to put that into perspective, into context. So those are the kind of things that I could go on for hours about this, but
I
it's
know.
it's stuff like this that I like to kind of like the students to kind of start realizing.
Yeah, it ignites in me that deep, deep love for life, love for being alive, love for what dies that creates life. And that's what motivates us to connect with another person or with trees and forests and animals and microbes. And it's beautiful. And one last piece of Dr. Bioakamalafe, speaking to your sharing about microplastics, and he tells a story, maybe you know more than I do, somewhere off of California coast. I think a oil rig that's not being used anymore. You can correct me if this sounds off.
Yeah.
But my point is that there's all, oh, it's bad, it's in the water, we got to get it out, get rid of it. But actually, all this life has attached to this structure. And so to remove it as being so bad, you would be annihilating this new life that is built all around this. It gives me goosebumps just to think that it is not black and white, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's actually papers on showing how oil rigs are actually biodiversity hotspots.
Oh, hotspots.
Yeah,
Thank
there's
you.
literally this whole like assemblage of like coral and fish and reefs that form on oil rigs. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's this idea of like if you see an oil rig, we tend to associate it with destruction. And for the most part, yes, that is true. But
True.
simultaneously, at the same time, if you go snorkeling in that region, you're going to find entire reef ecosystems that have formed on this. And so like
Yeah.
to quote Jurassic Park, like life finds a way, the whole like yeah, it's there. It's yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Life finds a way. So I'd like to believe we are finding a way through another chapter of human folly, to say it lightly. Well, Dr. Nigel, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much for lending your voice to this project, See Change Within Us, and bringing us to the smallest levels and all the way out to the macro level of stars. And yeah, continue with your work with blessing and letting the light come to the dark places, the unknown
Thank
when you're
you.
still seeking funding, and knowing that the light is always there bringing abundance. All
Thank you.
right.
Thank you
Thank
so much. Thank you so much. And again, I'm just offering, but if you want to have more conversations about this at any point, if there's anything more I can do to help with this, I would love to. So please just keep me in the loop.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.